victory for labor. The fact that the government was forced to talk to the unions signifies a shift from the callous attitude which has hitherto become normative by those charged with ensuring the welfare and socio-economic security of all our citizens. WPA is of the view that the industrial action by the teachers and the union earlier this year was a pivotal factor in this shift. The teachers' strike exposed to the world the embarrassing truth of a party which extols the virtues of workers' rights while at the same time crushing the workers' movement in its pursuit of political domination. WPA says to the teachers and to the GTU that you are the true heroes of this moment. The workers of all races and political persuasions owe you an eternal debt. The second observation we wish to make is that while the government is being dragged to the bargaining table, its eventual offer to the workers falls short, way short, of a living wage. WPA does not know what the counter offers from the unions were, but the fact that the packages were almost identical suggests that the government entered the negotiations with a fixed position, while workers, in the face of rising cost of living, will obviously welcome the increases. This should not be interpreted as satisfaction with the packages. The workers know very well the limitations of the packages. An objective examination of the packages, taking into consideration all the attendant factors, reveals that workers at the low end and mid-levels of the wage scale would not see much change in their ability to mitigate the crippling effects of the high cost of living. Given the increases in revenues from the oil sector and the government's willingness to spend large sums in other areas of the economy, WPA feels that much more should have been offered to the workers. WPA will have more to say in a year-end review of the government's performance in 2024. Finally, WPA bemoans the government's inability to articulate a clear wage policy. This is a defect which we have noted in successive budgets. It is our considered view that there is need for policy. In advancing these packages, what is the government's objective? We ask. WPA feels that a clear, necessary, and just wage package must take into consideration, at a minimum, the following factors. 1, the financial health of the country. 2, the cost of living. And 3, the competitiveness of public sector wages with those in the local private sector and the public sector in the wider Caribbean region. In addition, wages should be linked to poverty alleviation. WPA meeting with the PNC. As was reported in the media, a WPA delegation met this past week with the PNC. The meeting was in pursuit of WPA's twin objective. 1, being part of a grand coalition of opposition parties to contest the upcoming elections. And 2, forging a political praxis of consensus in the country. WPA is satisfied that the first meeting went well, and we look forward to the next meeting. As reported, both parties ventilated their experiences and analysis of the last coalition. and identified key areas for improvement. While the two sides committed to contesting the elections together, either as a PNC APNU plus WPA coalition or as part of a broader coalition of opposition parties, the details are still to be fleshed out. End of statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hines, for reading that statement. Professor Thomas will now give his comments. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. My concern is really to make two broad comments. The first is to reiterate our previous call, in fact, I might say our weekly call, that many of the things that we've asked for remain unfulfilled. We have not got any word back from the Vice President about the call for a due diligence report on the deal concerning the power ship. We have not got any response from him as regards an evaluation of the transfer payments that are being made by the cash grant. So we don't know exactly what the government is aiming at, so that we cannot give a firm view or measure our standards, established standards for evaluating the success of that program. And thirdly, we remain convinced in this particular instance that the government has really recognized that in Ghana, most of the poor are employed poor, and most of the employed poor is a group or a grouping falls within the public sector employment, both in the central government and to some extent in the public enterprises. I think it's about probably around 15% of our total employment labor force, available labor force, works with the public service. So the gains that have been made so far are marginal gains, but are not marginal, are minimal gains when put against the national background. Because even larger numbers of private employees, some of them working for small businesses in the cities and in other areas around the country, continue to pay under the living wage. The larger private employers take advantage of that and get cheap labor, which they use to reap big profits for themselves. So this success that is being reported here has to be evaluated in that broader context. And I think that it's important for us to recognize that even though the unions in the public service might have made some marginal gains, and in the context of the national struggle for removing poverty and getting closer to living wage, as you mentioned, a lot remains done. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Thomas. Brother Takumo, you may proceed with your comments.
Are you hearing me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I just want to make one comment. It's more or less that since the announcement that the WP have met with the PNC, there seems to be a lot of optimism on the ground among opposition supporters that at least the opposition has begun to take important steps in the fight or the struggle to achieve a broad-based coalition. And the sense I'm getting is that the optimism on the ground, okay, is widespread. And they're depending heavily on the two leaderships of the parties, the WP and the PNC, and our experience to achieve the widest possible coalition. And I know as a party, the WP is committed to that, and the PNC is also committed to that. But the challenge, in spite of our individual parties' commitment, we have to be realistic that the two parties acting on their own can guarantee a wide-based coalition. It's a challenge, and we in the WPA have taken up the challenge that we will fight to convince other important players in the political equation, particularly the AFC and other forces, that in the interest of the people and the country, we really have to rise to the moment to reach that massive expectations among opposition party supporters to deliver to them a grand coalition.
Thank you very much, Brother Takuma, for your comments. The floor is now open for questions from the media. Just indicate whether you have a question, and then I will have you proceed.
And the media house, you're from.
Hi, good morning. Swetlana Marshall from News Source. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we are.
To Dr. Hines, you spoke about the the agreement between the Public Service Union and the government, and the percentage offered by government falling short of a livable wage. What would be your recommendation? What percentage you think should have been put on the table by the government? And do you see the need for the percentages to be there to be varying percentages for different categories or levels of workers based on the salary they earn? I see another argument being put forward that it should not be across the board because it widens the gap between the poor and the rich. What's your perspective on that? And my other question has to do with the meeting with the PNCR. Could we expect a similar meeting with the AFC? And the AFC mentioned that, the PNC mentioned that WPA is also considering being part or returning to the APNU. Could you elaborate a bit on that? I know you mentioned a broad opposition coalition, and you mentioned PNC, APNU, WPA, but is it that you're now reconsidering their position on being part of APNU as an umbrella body? And also there's a lot of talk about the presidential candidate. Should there be a broad coalition? Who do you think should lead that coalition? Does it come from a major political party or the largest opposition party, or there should be consensus, or the person could come from any of the parties? And should you be the opposition leader spoke about having clear criteria for such identification of such person? What's your perspective on that? And the questions regarding the coalition is to any of the executive or any of the persons on the panel.
Thank you very much. I'll let Professor Thomas address the questions regarding the wage packages. Professor Thomas.
Well, let me go directly to the first question, which I picked up, is related to the wage package. There are within the agreements themselves special modifications to deal with the problem of a wage structure that is not based on a single wage being paid to everybody, which recognizes differences in skills, differences in qualifications, and so forth. And there are attempts to try to recompense to some extent for the lower percentages in terms of their absolute values for the lower ends of the wage scale. So I think, for example, the Schedule 1 to 6 in the TPS agreement that the government has agreed that they will treat every worker who's worked for 4 years to have reached the midpoint of the scale, which I think is generous, which means that they don't really start at 10%. They might start at, I would guess, somewhere around 13 to 14%. So the actual wage they'll be getting is based on a floor of 30 to 40% and not 10%. Because of the low scales within the schedules 1 to 6, they'll be able to move straight to the midpoint of the scale after 4 years of employment. But I figure it's fairly reasonable to give the people some chance to say that they have met the entry requirements and would have in normal circumstances, irrespective of the concrete level of achievement that they had made in a system that was working, would have reached the midpoint of the scale. So you have little things like that that are trying to address some of these things. And you shouldn't therefore underestimate the value of the benefits clauses in these agreements. But sometimes those turn out to be larger than you might think, particularly if they have tax-free components to them.
Professor Thomas, the other question she asked was in relation to what we would consider to be a living wage.
Well, I think I would want to give workers a living wage. They have to tell me. They have to ask what they feel they can live with. And I don't want to be the proponent of a living wage. And I think it's absurd to ask me to propose what is a living wage. But there have been calculations done in many countries to find out what should be the minimum wage. And I would certainly say that we have a minimum wage. But I don't think that it caters enough for what is required for living at the minimum. And that largely reflects the quality statistics that we have, because all these things, like, for example, the labor force survey, show that we have roughly about 300,000 employees in Ghana, and probably somewhere between 30 to 40,000 state employees. So we're a small fraction of the total who are being talked about this morning.
Okay, two hands are raised. And,
No, we haven't finished yet, Dion. She has
I know. I'm just acknowledging that we're going to bring them in as soon as these questions are clear. Go ahead. Yes, Professor.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's said enough. If
Yeah.
they need more specifics, they can ask again.
Yeah. As a party of the working people, we are always struggling and advocating for the working people to get as much as they could get to deal with their day-to-day circumstances, and also to deal with the cruelty of poverty. And so therefore, we are always in favor of proposals that are equitable in nature. That is, that while those at the top of the salary scale are given what is due to them, given what they put in as far as labor is concerned, we also feel that special consideration should always be given to those at the bottom of the ladder. We are very concerned about the large gap between the poor and the rich in the society. And that is why we feel that in addition to wages that are put in place to deal with that gap, that a basic minimum wage will go a long way to dealing with that gap. We hope that in the not too distant future, the government and other stakeholders can begin to talk about a basic wage for workers and for all Guyanese citizens. So yes, we are concerned about the gap between the rich and the poor, and we will support measures that are taken to close that gap. As it relates to the PNC WPA meeting, we feel that a priority has to be agreement on a program, agreement on a direction for the coalition, taking into consideration that we are vying for government. We have to agree to what we are going to put in place policy-wise when we get into government. We have to agree on a mode of governance when we get into government. We have to agree on mechanisms of decision-making when we get into government. Those for us are very, very important. Now, as it relates to a candidate, a presidential candidate for the coalition, the Constitution requires us to have a presidential candidate, and so we have to have a presidential candidate. The WPA feels that that should come after discussion and consensus among the parties involved. We in the WPA do not have a candidate to put forward, and so we are not burdened with that stress. But we do have an interest in who becomes the consensus candidates. And so we agree with the PNC that there should be clear guidelines as to how we arrive at a consensus candidate. We have not given much thought to a candidate coming from outside of the political parties, but we would not object to such a proposal if it is put on the table. We would discuss it. But we feel that it's early days yet in arriving at a consensus candidate. We feel that we have to have a consensus program, as we said, a consensus approach to governance. And I think out of that consensus program, out of that consensus approach to governance, we may get an insight into the type of person or candidate who should head the ticket. Suffice to say that one of the things that we have been very strong on, and we continue to be strong on, is that given the multi-ethnic nature of our society, the top of the ticket should reflect the multi-ethnic nature of the society. There's also the gender perspective. If we can arrive at a top of the ticket that reflects the multi-ethnic nature and the gender dynamics in the society, we will get the best of all worlds. But at a minimum, we will insist that the top of the ticket reflect the multi-ethnic nature of the society. I think I'm missing Svetlana. Oh yes, your question on whether the WPA is about to go back into APNU. That question was raised at the meeting. We did not spend much time discussing it. The WPA remains committed to maintaining its identity in any coalition that we are part of going forward. We will have to be convinced that the coalition would benefit from us going back into the APNU. At this point, we are not convinced.
And the question about meeting with the AFC?
Oh, yes. We note that the AFC has been meeting with other quote unquote small parties. We have not been approached to meeting with the AFC. When Mr. Hughes was first elected, I think within the first couple of weeks, we had a meeting with him. A delegation from our party met with him, and there was a commitment to meet again. We have not met since. And like I said, the AFC has said that it is meeting with all small parties. We have not gotten a call yet.
Okay. I see Dennis and I see Naomi. I really don't know whose hand went first, but I'll give the lady the preference, Dennis. So, Dennis was first. Okay then, Dennis. Go ahead with your questions.
Dr. Hines, what the party requires now a decision? I mean, you've started to talk with the PNC. What else do you want to be convinced that you should go back into the coalition? And
You mean the APNU?
Yes, the APNU. Why are you shying away from calling a figure that might be a minimum basic wage or an acceptable basic wage?
Well, your last question, I will defer to Professor Thomas, who is our economic expert. And Professor Thomas.
Okay, 1 minute comment on it now.
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's a fairly dynamic question, and I would hate to put down a number at this point in time in mid-December of 2024, even for a year ahead. And that's what a prudent economist would do. Never stick a neck for a particular number. We know what the elements will be. We've got an idea of what we would like to see put into a basket of basic support in terms of our Buxton proposal, and therefore some minimum basic income that will give universally to every single household. But beyond that, we don't have a specific figure that we will call in 2024, at the end of 2024, because we don't even know what the inflation rate will be at the end of this year. As you know, the statistics that the government is putting out on the inflation rate has been hotly contested. In fact, I have an article coming soon to talk about the fierce controversies over that is existing right now over the use of the consumer price index put out by the Bureau of Statistics, creating a lot of controversy in the academic and economic world and the business world. So I would hesitate to put something over my hat to offer the public right now. I don't think it's prudent.
Dennis, as it relates to the APNU, first of all, the APNU seems to be in some turmoil. There was what we saw as an attempt to remove the PNC from leadership of the APNU by other parties. We don't know whether they have sorted out their issues. We would not want to go into an APNU that is in that state. We know that GAP met with the PNC, GAP met with the AFC. Judging from the statements put out by the AFC and the statement put out by the PNC and GAP after their meeting, one is not sure whether GAP is still part of the APNU. So we would not want to go back into a partnership that is in that kind of confusion and turmoil. As it relates to a minimum for us, there were several problems we had with the APNU. One was our identity was smothered. If someone can convince us that we can go back into the APNU and our identity would not be smothered, then we are willing to listen to that. Secondly, we had the situation where the leadership of the APNU, which was the leadership of the AFC, the APNC, making decisions for us without consulting us. We had a situation, for example, with the Walter Rodney Commission of Inquiry. The APNU AFC government decided to halt that inquiry, and within the APNU, nobody consulted us as the most interested party. There was no consultation. with us on that. When Dr. Rupnarain was removed from the position of education minister, we in the APNU did not discuss it. The WPA was not given the option of naming a replacement for Dr. Rupnarain. Those two examples really reflect the way in which the APNU functioned in the past. And we have to be convinced that it would not function in that way in the future before even consider going back into the APNU. And so therefore the question of identity, the question of decision making, and the turmoil in the APNU at the moment are factors that are keeping us from even considering the issue at this time.
Are you satisfied with the responses, Dennis? Any follow-up?
No, I'm not, because I would think that by now, given the extensive studies over the years by Professor Thomas, at least we may have been able to glean from him an estimate that he considers to be a working number for the average working poor person in Guyana working in the public service. So I'm not satisfied.
Okay. Well, does Professor want to respond to that?
Well, I don't want to be a sorcerer or a clairvoyant, so I remain steadfast in my view that this is something that should not come out of a single brain, and it should come out of the collective experiences of the public service itself. So they should have a part to play in arriving in that decision. I stand by that.
Well, Dennis, in addition to what Professor Thomas said, without giving a number, we did say in our statement this morning that we think a wage policy should take into consideration the cost of living. It should take into consideration the revenues that the government is getting now from oil and gas, and that it's projected to get in the near future. And the third factor is the competitiveness of wages with the private sector, the local private sector, and with the Caribbean public service. Clearly, our workers are not getting near what their counterparts in the rest of the Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean, are earning, and we feel that that is something that we should aspire to. We think that that is something that we should aspire to, because we are losing our workers, our teachers, our nurses to these countries. And so one of the ways of ensuring that our public servants remains well equipped with the skills that are needed in a petrol state and in a modern economy is to ensure that their wages are competitive. And we have a private sector now that goes beyond clerks. Given the oil economy, we have a private sector that is going to pay much more than our traditional private sector has been paying. And so we run the risk of losing skills to the private sector. And so therefore, as we think about wages and salary, as we think about where we want our workers to be, as we think about arriving at a minimum number to begin with, and then one that constitutes a living wage, we think that those three factors are going to be pivotal at arriving at a number. So while I agree, and I do agree with Professor Thomas, that we don't want to throw a number out of, pick a number and throw it out of our heads, we do have a sense of what are the factors that need to come into play as we contemplate what a minimum livable wage should be.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Hines. Ms. Paris, would you want to ask a question now?
Yeah, good morning, Naomi for the Chronicle. My questions are for Mr. Hines. Just picking up on your comments about the app news being seeming to be in some sort of turmoil. Are you willing to endorse um Aubrey Norton as the presidential candidate of the Grand Coalition?
We have not gotten to that point yet, as I explained. What we do know that we don't have a candidate that we are putting forward. We can say that without any big conflict. We don't have a candidate we are putting forward at this time. As it relates to Norton, we understand that Nigel Hughes is being spoken of as another candidate. Our position is that both Mr. Norton and Mr. Hughes are capable of assuming the office of president, and so therefore could be very capable presidential candidates. But we have not had a discussion in the WPA as to what our preference will be. And so to answer the question, we think we'll be going out on a limb, and we haven't gotten to that point yet.
All right, still on the topic of coalition, there have been some reports that the talks of a coalition are a sign of desperation. Since the WPA, after being a part of the APNU AFC, had criticized the PNCR for its actions, do you believe that voters will have confidence, or do you think they'll believe in coalition politics, or will they take it seriously?
Well, coalition politics is the politics of the future. All over the world, people are moving towards coalition politics because coalition politics will move us closer to a national consensus. And when you are a country like Guyana, where you have diverse ethnicities, where we are socially diverse society, consensus and coalition are better than one-party politics. One-party politics really is one race politics, one ethnicity politics, one ideology politics. And in a diverse society like ours, it is safer and more effective to move towards coalition politics. So we are convinced that that is the politics of the future. As to whether people will support it or not, that is left to be seen. We can't and say we know people will support coalition politics. What we do know is that a larger percentage, slightly larger percentage of the electorate voted for a coalition in 2015. That is a fact that cannot be denied. And that as small as a large minority, just one seat less, voted for the coalition in 2020, if we go by the figures declared. So we don't see a rejection of coalition politics if you go by the votes for the coalition. So we just wanted to point that out. Listen, if you study politics along our historical trajectory, contending factions in any country have always sought to come together in the interests of the country. The PPP in 1977 put forward a National Patriotic Front government to include itself and the PPP and the PNC. The PPP again in 1985 began negotiations with the Burnham-led government that they opposed bitterly, yet they entered talks with the Burnham government and were very close to arriving at a joint PNC-PPP government with the PPP willing to serve under the presidency of Burnham. The PPP again, in as we move towards the 1992 elections, were prepared to be part of a larger government, what Dr. Jackman called the Mandela formula, that include the PPP, the PNC, sorry. So this thing about, because one criticizes a party, one cannot collate with that party is utter nonsense. And it's not borne out by our history and the political history of the world. So we wish that those who are supportive of the PPP and perhaps supportive of the PPP's talk about not wanting to get into coalition, stop it, because it is not supported by our history and by the PPP's own action. I want to repeat, especially for younger people, that the PPP on more than one occasion, in the middle of what all of us call the Burnham dictatorship, the PPP was willing to be part of a government that included Mr. Burnham and to serve under Mr. Burnham as president. Thank you.
All right, I do have another question. You mentioned that the WPA at this time does not have a presidential candidate to put forward. So my question for that now is, how does a political party like the WPA remain credible and relevant, especially when most of your leaders are in their late 70s and the party has not replenished its leadership with younger people?
Well, I can tell you that I'm not in my late 70s, and that there's several people here who are not in their late 70s, and that we have a lot of members and supporters who are not in their late 70s. We parties are not in the business of opening their books and saying, here are our members and here are their ages. No party does that, right? Our party has young members. Our party has members who are not in their 70s. And since when age is determines credibility to be a political party? Barry Jack Dio is 60 years old. We are almost the same age. I hear him all the time talking about old people, as if some or the other, he's young compared to people like me. We are the same age, around the same age group. So since when this business that age equals credibility? No, it doesn't.
But does the party have?
I'm wondering how do I look, Ms. Paris? I look old.
Yeah, you
Older
look like your late 70s. Yes, Ms. Paris, go ahead.
Yeah, but does the party have any intentions of, bringing on some new faces?
Wait, you will confront those new faces.
All right, my final question.
Yes.
So, Mr. Ang, are you prepared to forego your U.S. citizenship to properly contest the upcoming elections, even if that's in a grand coalition?
Ms. Paris,
You're assuming things, my
Ms.
dear.
Paris, as we would say in Guyanese parlance, the Chronicle wants to know my business. I am not a U.S. citizen. I have never been a U.S. citizen. The only citizenship I've had in my entire life is Guyanese citizenship. So please, the Chronicle, you now know my business.
But as a young person, Naomi, the basis for research is asking. What you should have done is ask whether he is a U.S. citizen or not. I mean, in research methodology, you can't go to a person and with an assumption already made, and then you're saying you're inquiring. It's totally erroneous. All right. So next time they give you a question like that, tell them it's not relevant and it's not proper. All right. Thank you. Any other thing you want to talk about?
Those are all my questions for now.
Okay. Any other question that anyone wants to ask? Are we through? Any other comment from the panelists? Brother Rohit, do you have any comment you want to make? Rohit, are you there?
And if
Yes,
I may,
sir.
before Rohit comes in, Brother Dion, Ms. Paris, the WPA has announced its presidential candidate. So we do have a presidential candidate. What we are saying that is at this point, we are not proposing our presidential candidate as a presidential candidate for a possible coalition. But we do have a presidential candidate who is a Guyanese citizen and has always been a proud Guyanese citizen.
Yes, Brother Rohit, go ahead.
Okay. I think on the question of wages, the national basic income that we are proposing plays an important role in equalizing some of the inequities of the current wage structures. So I think that's an important part of the consideration. Even in terms of national policy, the WPA has raised the issue of a national government. And even the issue that the government had proposed of constitutional reform seems to have dropped out of the picture completely. So we need to revisit some of those issues in terms of having a genuine national government. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Rohit. Dr. Canterbury, any comments you want to make before we bring this conference to a close?
Just to reinforce what Professor Thomas said about us determining national wages for Guyana, we have to have the data to do this with the and then to collate with other agencies and the labor unions before we could actually talk about how to arrive at a wage, at such a wage. And in fact, the TUC is the organization that is involved with helping to determine this. We also need to have proper statistics to understand what's happening. And then, of course, the time of the year is not the time of the year, as Professor Thomas pointed out, is not a time that we should actually announce or something like that. We got to understand the projections for wages, inflation. It's too many factors, as you pointed out, and as well as Dr. Hines surmised all the different factors we would take into consideration to formulate such a wages policy. So those are my comments.
Right. I want to thank the media for being with us today and all the people who are watching online. And I want to thank the panelists from the Working People's Alliance for, again, dealing with matters that are pertinent to the life and livelihood of people here in Guyana. We look forward to being with you next week for another press conference of the Working People's Alliance. Do enjoy the rest of your morning.